think we're gonna get started. So I'm Camille Ledorna, Learning Manager here at ASI. I'm very happy to welcome all of you to this webinar on a responsible sourcing toolkit that was developed by European Aluminium and based on criteria related to responsible sourcing policies that are included in ASI Standards. ASI is a standard setting and certification organization that defines globally applicable standards for the aluminium value chain, on sustainability performance, and on chain of custody. In the performance standard, criterion 2.4 states that the entity, which is the company seeking certification, shall implement a responsible sourcing policy covering environmental, social, and governance issues. And in the chain of custody standard, criterion 7.1 states that the entity shall adopt and communicate to suppliers of non-chain of custody material and recyclable scrap material a responsible sourcing policy covering aluminium, which as a minimum takes account of criterion 2.4 of the performance standard. So the toolkit that's going to be presented today aligns with these two criteria. Our presenter today is Colline Lavorel, who is Director of Public Affairs and Communication at European Aluminium. She will present the toolkit for developing a responsible sourcing policy. And Angela Huang, the Sustainability Project Manager at Constellium, will also join us to share some insights on the implementation of Constellium responsible sourcing policy. So thank you very much to both of you for joining us. And note that we will go through the questions at the end of the session, so you can post all your questions through the questions pane throughout the session, and we will try to answer all of them at the end. In case we don't have time to answer all the questions, you can contact us by email after the session. And we are recording this session, and it will be posted on our learning platform, Educational, to be available to everyone afterwards. So without further ado, Colline, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Camille, and good afternoon to all of you. So my name is Colline. I work for European Aluminium. And before I get into the toolkit, I'd like just to briefly introduce you European Aluminium. So we are an industry association. We represent the whole European value chain of aluminium. We have more than 80 members, more than 600 plants in 30 European countries, which represents 1 million direct and indirect jobs across Europe. And on the next slide, you can see the companies that we represent. So you see that they are really across the whole value chain. So from the primary production, the semi-fabrication, and the recycling activities. We have a variety of members from large companies to also rather medium and small size companies. And we also represent national associations. So I will now give you some elements of context of this toolkit on responsible sourcing, starting with just a reminder about the European aluminium industry's sustainability agenda to 2025. So indeed, in 2015, we launched our sustainability roadmap to 2025. We called it Common Goals and Shared Actions. It's a roadmap which reflects the European aluminium industry's commitment to sustainability, setting voluntary targets for 2025 in 3 areas. So one on responsible production, innovative applications, and socio-economic contribution. And so member companies are working on collaborative projects. We also engage with stakeholders, and we monitor the progress towards the target through a set of indicators. So as part of this sustainability roadmap, we have one objective, which is the responsible sourcing. So on the next slide, we summarize here so the objectives and the definitions. As you may have noticed, the roadmap was launched the same year as ASI. And so logically, we could find some natural synergies with ASI, and in particular on responsible sourcing. So as objective in our roadmap, members have set the objective to source raw materials responsibly from an environmental, economic, and social perspective, promoting traceability best practices. And so in the definitions of responsible sourcing is about really to create a virtuous supply chain and follow a set of rules and practices to ensure long-term business success and to contribute to better environment, economic and social development. So in other words, it basically requires also a strong supply chain policy. So it means how your company wants to interact with its supply chain in a way that allows the company to identify risks of violation of fundamental rights and principles in 3 areas, which links back to the quite known ESG, so environmental, social responsibility, governance, and ethics. So with this in the framework, so in the roadmap, more specifically, the commitment from our members is to contribute to improve the available sourcing and traceability standards and to set a core criteria which all members will comply, regardless of the chosen reporting standard. So it means that whether or not companies would like to join ASI, we make sure that there is a common set of criteria on responsible sourcing across the entire aluminium value chain, which members are committed to fulfill. So now moving a bit more deeply into the concept of responsible sourcing, I'd like to highlight here that this is quite a dynamic business case for sustainable supply chain. There are some important drivers to move to a sustainable supply chain policy, starting from drivers coming from consumer awareness, the role of media, more sensitive to environmental and social issues, the role of NGOs, the expectations of customers, financing organizations that want to limit risks. And so there are immediate benefits also for the business when it comes to establishing responsible sourcing policy. It can reduce reputation and liability risks. It ensures better compliance to regulations and avoid future costs. It improves potentially also the position with rating agencies. It enables better access to capitals, well, with enhanced trust from financing institutions. It can also lead to new business developments. And last but not least, it can ensure also a better stability, both from the employees, but also the customers. And it increases also value to shareholders by reducing also the risks. So there are clear business drivers for a responsible sourcing policy. So moving a bit more concretely into this toolkit, which we have developed with our membership. And here I'd like just to spend a couple of minutes to explain a bit the internal process. So we have within our association a sustainability committee, which has as a clear objective to supervise the implementation of the objective and monitor the progress made to the targets that are set in the sustainability roadmap. And so we started working within this group and then more broadly with our membership. The objective, as I said in the beginning, was to make sure that there are synergies with the work done by ASI. So exactly not reinventing the wheel, but rather to build up on the good work done there and the criteria identified, but developing a toolkit with a very pragmatic approach that would be helpful for also, in particular, smaller and medium-sized companies. So we ran a survey with our members, and it was an interesting exercise also to see some common points and also maybe also some gaps, which helped us to develop the toolkit. So to make sure that we could also address some of those gaps. So what we found out is that in majority, the purchasing of companies is centralized, that they have also a central database of suppliers, that they also want to develop long-term relationship with their suppliers, which sounds quite obvious, depending sometimes of the type of supply that they need. Sometimes the relationship is shorter. And they do use some incentives to increase the sustainability performance of their suppliers. So it goes from training, increasing the business with them, sharing experience, but also setting sometimes purchasing framework agreements. And they also have some commonalities in the way to check if suppliers are fulfilling the environmental, social, and governance criteria with site visits, audits, sometimes also signing a code of conduct, some third-party verification, and even some pre-qualification of suppliers. So there are some, let's say, already practices that we could identify. What came out from this survey is that more than half of the respondent or companies that responded have no documented responsible policy in place. So it means that the practice is there, maybe also the culture is there, but it's not documented, it's not maybe also systematic. So that's what we've tried to address with this toolkit, is to make it, to help companies that have already something in place to improve, and for those that are starting from let's say more limited practice, to help them to increase and to improve what they to go to a higher level, let's say. So as a starting point, on the next slide, we've tried to summarize 4 pillars in this responsible sourcing policy that helped us to structure the work. So one first fundamental aspect for this responsible sourcing policy is the risk assessment. So it's the capacity for the company to identify, characterize actual and potential risks. The second aspect is the implication of senior management. And behind that, this is really the accountability behind it, which is really essential. With the need also to make sure that the responsible sourcing policy is linked to the broader sustainability policy of the company. Third point is the fact that there is also the need to have written policies and procedures in place. The purpose is really there to help the companies to clarify its position on key issues, and also to say clearly the ways to implement its policies. And last but not least, the fourth point is about recording and transparency. So really keep record of or try also measure the progress over time, because this really provides very valuable information for then internal review and potentially also external audits. As much as possible also in these written policies, how the evaluation is done and the frequency of this evaluation also could be considered. So on the next slide, here we focus on the supply chain policy. So that's a fundamental aspect of a responsible sourcing policy. So as I said in the beginning, is really how your company is interacting with its suppliers and how it's managing the risks. And of course, the objective is here to create a virtuous cycle. So to make sure that suppliers cascade in their turn the policy and the measurements of their own suppliers. And so the involvement of a supplier in this work is fundamental. And here that enables me to make the link with our proposal to develop a template for a supplier code of conduct. On the next slide, you can see here. So the approach was really to make it more easy for companies either to improve their policies, or to which are companies that are starting from really from scratch, to put in place this template for a supplier code of conduct. So it formally states the commitment of the companies to responsibly make responsible purchase procurement, and to work only with suppliers that can meet their standards and values. And logically, it's built around three main chapters, which links back to ESG, so the governance and ethics, labor and human rights, health and safety, and environment. And here the recommendation is to encourage to ask your suppliers to sign this code of conduct. As we see, this is quite also a common practice among our members. Moving then to the guidelines. So as part of the toolkit, we've made a bit more longer document of 14 pages, which goes a bit more deep into the subject and provide really a step-by-step approach on how and where to start. So really how the different steps to follow to implement a responsible sourcing policy. The audience there is obviously addressed to the person in charge of responsible sourcing or CSR. We've tried as much as we could to make it SME friendly to some extent. So also have a very pragmatic approach and explain the steps quite in details. But of course, it should also be helpful for bigger companies. It follows the ESG structure, and it's referring also to ASI Standards. So the purpose again is not to reinvent the wheel, but to build up from some basic level to intermediate and more mature, depending on where the company is. So on the next slide, it's just, I think, a reminder of the criteria used by under the ASI performance standards. So under governance, environment, and social, which I will get back to those a bit later in the presentation. But there, so very pragmatically, which are the steps that you should follow for your sustainable supply chain policy. So we have identified 5 steps. So one is to develop your own policy. Secondly is to identify your key suppliers. Third, how to do a simple risk assessment. Fourth, once you have identified the risks, make sure you can make the changes that are appropriate. And the 5th point is about communication. So I'll go through all the steps with some explanation on the different steps to follow. So the first step is I will insist on the fact that it's important that companies develop their own policy. So it's really about getting a team as much as possible, also involving your senior management in there. Sorry, and start with a series of questions to be answered. So if the next slide can appear, you will see that the first set of questions is about what is the nature of your business. So what are your activities, what goods and services you procure, how big are you, etc. Secondly is what are the changes that you want to achieve in terms of sustainable supply chain. So is it just focusing on your immediate suppliers or contractors, all suppliers? What is also reasonable for you to achieve, considering also your specific situation? And what is your ability to influence this change? So can you switch to another suppliers? Can you have the choice? Are you small or are you big? So can you influence also your supplier? Or if you cannot influence it directly, can you do so through, for example, an industry association? So that's the first step, and we recommend really to make it also as a teamwork, not just the person responsible for responsible sourcing, but really have it across the company or the organization. The second step is how to identify your key suppliers. So that's something that also came up in the answers to the survey we've made to members. That how do we define key suppliers? Is there a common definition? And we could see that there are some similarities, but at the same time, not really a very harmonized way of defining key suppliers. So here we came up with some points, some elements that could help in this definition. So first question is, are these suppliers important to your business? So really, basically, without them, you would not be able to operate. Second question is how can they affect your reputation, even if their practice is not really related to you directly. And the third is about the potential risk on your workers, on your community, on your environment. So these are elements that can help you to make also kind of selection or identify at least which are your key suppliers. So the third step is basically once you have identified your key suppliers, you should process a simple risk assessment. So to identify the risk on your reputation and the compliance with your supply chain policy. Of course, when it comes to risk assessment, companies may have their own approach, but we've developed also a simple assessment grid to help, especially the one that don't have this policy yet in place. And this is really built around 3 simple questions, which you can see on the screen here. I will just develop the first one, but in the toolkit, you have also the 2 others. So the question to ask yourself is, okay, how good do I know my supplier? And if I'm in the red, in the green, green answers means that I'm still in a low risk case. So I have a long-term relationship with this supplier, have good experience with its quality and services. It has been referred by trusted partners. We have a good and open relationship. I could also visit their sites many times. And they also formally support my sustainable supply chain policy. So here, clearly, we are in a low risk case. When we are in a high risk case, the answers would be rather, I don't know this supplier, it's the first time I work with him. I have no reference from other trusted partners. I've never visited the site, and the company doesn't support my sustainable supply chain policy. So these are quite clear answers to help make the difference. So if we move to the following slide after the risk assessment, it's about making the change. So it's really always limiting the risk and making sure that you get into this virtual cycle of also sustainable, responsible sourcing. So if you are in a low risk, the objective there should be to maintain your good and transparent relationship, and still to periodically reconfirm that the supplier is a low risk for your business. If you're in a high risk case, you may take actions, and here we only list some examples. First is you move to another supplier if you have the option. If you don't have the option to move to a different supplier, you should apply close scrutiny and control and mitigate risks on your reputation. And you can make this control through inspections, also checking back the contracts, the contractual relations you have with the supplier. But you can also and should certainly use this as an opportunity to speak and engage in a dialogue with your supplier. So to assist the supplier to improve its practices. Of course, depending on the size of your company, but you may think about organizing trainings, for example. So this is a way, and I will get back to it later, but the importance of the dialogue with your supplier, which links to the last step, which is about communication. So very important to communicate to your workers what is your policy, when it applies. It can be done in a formal way through trainings, can be done informally as well. Also very important to involve your employees, your workers in the risk assessment, or at least the one that are in close contact with the suppliers. Communicate, of course, to your suppliers and try to make it as much as possible formal. So make sure that they understand and that they acknowledge the policy. So sending an email, for example, wouldn't be enough to give you enough guarantee that there is first a good understanding, and secondly that the supplier is compliant with your criteria. And the best, I mean, one of the recommendation at least is to make them sign the code of conduct. But also you can think about communication to your external stakeholders, so your customers, local community, policymakers, anyone that has an interest in your business, because it can be positive for your reputation. So, as I said, so the guidelines and the toolkit we developed is to help companies to adopt a more systematic approach, and that's where now it links much more in details with the ASI criteria. So in the toolkit you have all the examples and the explanation. I just pick up here 2 examples. But so what we've done is to look into the environmental governance and social criteria identified under the ASI performance standards, and try to make them explicit or give example of what it implies. So, for example, on business integrity, we've said that to implement it, you may have a system to ensure updated compliance with the laws. You may have an anti-corruption policy, and you may also have a code of conduct. When it comes to labor rights, for example, another example, so make sure that you have a policy that does not allow for any support of child labor, enable freedom of association, right for collective bargaining, ensure you are implementing non-discrimination, allowing equal opportunities, transparent communication with your stakeholders, also complying with the legal aspects of remuneration and working time. So these are just a way to make those criteria explicit for companies, so to help them understand what are behind the all these criteria. So in the last slide, it's a recap of the different steps. So I will just go through and very briefly, but remind, so to apply someone, you need to have someone accountable. You need to make sure you endorse also the senior management to make it part of your overall sustainability commitments. Develop your own policy, so that really addresses your needs, your special environment, and make sure that you have it in a simple document, that you have it written, and that you clarify the procedure. Use a risk-based approach, so to identify the risks in the all areas of your activities, to identify your key suppliers. Communication is very important, as we said, so to employees, to suppliers, because that's how you can ensure also this virtuous cycle. Working with suppliers using different tools, from the code of conduct, audits, trainings, plant visits, so different ways of engaging with your suppliers. And last but not least, make sure you trace back your progress. So define your own performance indicators, so you can continuously improve the practices, the culture in your organization when it comes to responsible sourcing. And as I said at the beginning, of course, there may be a basic approach, and gradually you can improve over time, and you may want to refer to more global standards like the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, and also, of course, ASI standards. So that's the end of the presentation of the toolkit. I would like to also communicate that this toolkit is available and will be made available to ASI members and European Aluminium members. So that's something that we will circulate after this webinar. So thanks for your attention, and I pass over to Camille.
Thank you very much, Colleen. Thank you for this great presentation. If you have any questions, you can send them through the questions pane, and we will try to answer them at the end of the session. So now Angela is going to present you Constellium Sustainable Purchasing Policy. Angela, over to you.
Thank you, Camille. Hi, everyone. My name is Angela Huang. I work at Constellium as the Sustainability Project Manager. I'm in charge of our Sustainable Purchasing Program, various social topics, reporting, and communication. Can you move to the next slide, please? Yeah, before I begin to share Constellium's experience in sustainable purchasing, just a few words about Constellium Group. Constellium is a global leader designing and manufacturing value-added aluminum products and solutions for a very broad range of applications. We have three primary markets: aerospace, automotive, and packaging. We offer rolled, extruded products, automotive components, and we produce aluminum out of recycled metal. We have about 13,000 employees working in more than 28 manufacturing sites in Europe, North and Central America, and China, and 3 R&D centers. Our revenue in 2019 was 5.9 billion euros. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, here you can see where we operate our manufacturing sites, R&D center, and corporate office. Next slide, please. Yeah, so to begin with, I want to say the sustainable purchasing is part of our 2020 sustainability agenda. It is under the responsible business pillar, along with the objective to achieve ASI certification. I will talk about a bit more in details about our objectives. Next slide, please. So at Constellium, we aim to work only with suppliers who comply with applicable laws and commit to sustainable practices in governance, environment, society, and social. We published our responsible supply chain management policy in 2017. In this policy, we have three main commitments. The first one is to respect conflict mineral regulations. So on this one, we have an annual disclosure conform with the Dodd-Frank Act requirements. And our second commitment is to have our contracted suppliers sign off our supplier code of conduct or provide their own if that reflects the same principles. I think this, as mentioned by Colleen, is a common practice, and we're continuing to work with our suppliers on this. The third commitment is supplier due diligence. So we do assessment or audit on our key or risky suppliers. The whole process you can see here, we start with an internal mapping process, and then we move to assessment or audit. And at the end, we review the results and require improvements on our suppliers. If you can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so here I would like to talk a bit more about our internal mapping process. As you can imagine, when we start the sustainable purchasing program, we have a very vast base of suppliers. We cannot check on everyone. So we start with an internal mapping process with our purchasing team. We actually categorize our suppliers into two groups. The first group is, we call it key suppliers, and that is defined by annual spending by Constellium. So we look at our direct and indirect suppliers. For direct suppliers, for us, it's metal and energy suppliers. We define threshold of volume or spending for each category. For indirect suppliers, we look at the top 10 suppliers of spending of our major sites and also the main corporate managed category. For another group of suppliers, we call them risky suppliers. We look at the risks that we carry when being supplied by certain suppliers. What kind of risk we look at? So we look at risks associated with the material or service that we are acquiring. We also look at the risks associated with the locations that suppliers are located. For this, we consult international index, for example, the Corruption Perception Index. That's a very good indicator. In the meantime, not only these external indicators help us to map the risky suppliers, we also rely on experience of our buyers. So when they do site visits, technical or quality audits, they would also discuss and have a feeling or witness the condition or how the supply works. So based on this experience, we also identify suppliers as in this risky suppliers. If now you can look at the process chart above. So once we've done the internal mapping process, we identify two groups of suppliers. And for each one of them, we take a different approach in our supplier due diligence. For high-risk suppliers, we identify about 15 suppliers in this group. For them, we conduct on-site audits. We work with Intertek, a third-party audit service provider. We use a particular module, which is called Workplace Condition Assessment, and we require this assessment to be done every 3 years. For key suppliers, we identify about 200 of them that represent about 3.1 billion euros spending of Constellium. It's about 77% of our 2018 annual spending. So for this group of suppliers, we require them to do a desktop assessment. We work with EcoVadis platform on this. And after the assessment, we review and discuss with the supplier about their results. If the result is not up to our expectations, we require them to do either corrective action plans or reassessment. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yes. So as you can see here, well, I would like to mention Constellium is actually at the beginning of the ASI initiative. We are one of the founding members. So we are also taking the standards and the principles of the standard in our supply chain management policy. In our policy, we specifically mentioned that we encourage our key metal suppliers and assist them to join ASI or other sustainability programs. Also, we consider that in our current due diligence process. If a supplier has a site supplying us are certified, then we will not require them to do further assessment or audit. I go to next slide, please. So here, I think Colleen also mentioned communication is a very important tool in implementing sustainable purchasing. And we absolutely agree on that. For us, we do internal and external communications about our program. Internally, for our purchasing team, we do in-person or ad hoc training over the phone. And also, we do regular review of the progress of the implementation, annual review on the results, and also objective setting for the next year. For a wide employee audience, we recently launched a sustainability e-learning module, which includes the sustainable purchasing. We also do training to certain functions, such as sales or strategy or our new hire employees. On the external side, our policy and code of conduct is actually one of the best tools to communicate about our principles and expectations. They are available online in 7 languages. We also provide on-demand webinar or training to our suppliers. For our buyers, they have tools at hand for them to communicate with their suppliers. It includes a formal letter, brief presentation about our program and policy, as well as Q&A. The sustainability team, well, also have, ad hoc discussion with suppliers regarding their corrective action plan. Actually, here I think we have very frequent exchanges with our suppliers, and sometimes we understand that they might need more guidance or support, to improve their sustainability performance. And I think the toolkit that developed by European Aluminium is a great tool for us, for Constellium, to help our suppliers to build their capacities in responsible purchasing. On the external side, we also disclose our progress with our stakeholders. So it is in our annual business and sustainability report. Next slide, please. So here, just to share a bit our progress to date. If you remember, I mentioned it is part of our 2020 sustainability agenda. We have 2 indicators to measure our progress. First is number of assessment and audits that we performed. So by the end of 2019, we actually started our program in 2015. By the end of 2019, we have 124 suppliers assessed by EcoVadis. It represents about 66% of our total spending. We have conducted 14 on-site audits. And the other indicators that we look at is suppliers who signed, percentage of suppliers who signed our code of conduct. So among the identified key suppliers, we have more than 50% suppliers signed. Here I also want to say, I think the efforts and achievements of our sustainable purchasing program actually contributed to our ASI certification process. Now we have our casting and rolling operations in Singen, Germany, certified in performance and chain of custody standard. Well, it's not listed here, but we also just received our certification of performance standard in our Nobrizac facility in France. I can see really our sustainable purchasing program contributed our conformance in to the ASI standard, especially part of the responsible sourcing. Another good example, of such program contributing to external rating or our reputation is our recent EcoVadis score of the Constellium group. We reached to the platinum level. So that also thanks to our sustainable purchasing program. Next. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Angela. So maybe we can start with the questions that came in for regarding Constellium approach, actually. So first question, how are environmental and human rights issues considered when internal mapping?
Sorry?
How are environmental and human rights issues considered when internal mapping?
Yes, so as you can see, we can go back to the slide. Yeah, so in the internal mapping, I would say it's more on the risk side, because the first group key supplier is really about the materiality of the supplier. So on the risk side, I would say the social and the environment side we look at, for example, we have Human Rights Development Index rank. We assess that by the on-site visit of our buyers. So that's how we evaluate that in the risk mapping.
Okay, thank you, Angela. And second question for you. Is Constellium willing to compensate suppliers for the costs involved with EcoVadis?
that is a very good question. So I think EcoVadis is the tool that we choose to assess our suppliers, and we know that in the EcoVadis business model, there's cost for buyers like Constellium and suppliers to be on the platform. However, we think it's also a way for our suppliers to have their performance assessed, and in this model, they are able to share with many other of their customers. So I think that's a way also more and more people get on the platform, the less marginal cost it is. So we really encourage our suppliers to go through this platform.
Okay, thank you. Another question for you. Do you consider ASI certification as a competitive advantage over time? Or do you think the whole industry will be certified in short notice?
I think for now, when people are really getting on board in the ASI standard, it is now indeed competitive advantage. However, with the time, going forward, more and more people joining, I think in the future it will become actually a must-have, even a license to operate. That's my personal view.
Okay, thank you. And would you also recommend the ASI EcoVadis for small-size suppliers, given the potential impact of the process and the workload on the smaller suppliers?
Can you please repeat the question?
Would you also recommend the ASI EcoVadis for small-size suppliers? That can be critical, given the potential impact of the process on the workload on the smaller suppliers.
I understand. So for us, basically, we know that ASI standard apply to aluminum value chain. So, but EcoVadis assessment for us applies to a broader supplier base. For smaller suppliers, in, let's say, not the metal category, we really encourage them to do EcoVadis. And for our key metal suppliers, we encourage them to do ASI. So I understand the workflow is significant, but you will see that the standard is actually helping you to improve your performance. And like I said, I think it will become more and more important in the competitive advantage, or eventually become a must have a license to operate.
Okay, thank you. Another question coming in for you, Angela. Do you also visit your suppliers' labor camps to check living conditions and welfare?
Sorry, I didn't get the first one.
Do you also visit your suppliers' labor camps to check living conditions and welfare?
So basically, in the on-site audit that we do, we work with a third-party auditor. So they visit the site, and I myself and our buyers sometimes accompany this audit process. So we also, visit suppliers as an observer of the audit. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, thank you. On the same topic, do all risky suppliers receive a site visit before onboarding?
Before onboard, sorry, the last part.
Before onboarding, yeah.
Yeah, so we take a collaborative approach. So the ideal situation is to audit the supplier before the onboarding. However, sometimes we do it in parallel. So we will see, what can work with the supplier, what works the best for the supplier and also for us. And If I may add just one thing to the previous question, I think there's a question asking about EcoVadis for small suppliers. So I think the EcoVadis questionnaires is actually customized based on the company's activity, product, and the size. So when small suppliers, they join or they do the EcoVadis questionnaire, the questionnaire will be adapted to their size. So it works for small suppliers. I forgot to mention.
Okay, thank you. Still a question for you, Angela, and also for Colleen if she wants to jump in. What do you think is the role added value of a sectorial association as European Aluminium in fostering the responsible sourcing practices?
Yes, well, I can provide a first answer. I think what we can offer first is the exchange of best practices. So really a platform where companies can share their practices and learn from each other. Then I hope with this toolkit we may help also companies to practically improve their current practices, learn from others, and yeah, I think that's all we can do. I think that's very practical, but because also our membership is quite diverse in size of companies, we've the added value of exchanging between them should help improving their situation.
Okay, thank you. Another question for you, Colleen, about where to get the toolkit. When and how can we get a copy of the toolkit?
Yes, so as I said, I think we will circulate it by mail. As European Aluminium, we have our internal system, so it's on our extranet. I think for ASI members, you may send it by email. So we have it's a set of 4 documents. So the guidelines, the template for the responsible sourcing, a slide deck, and a reference of documents. So a reference of source of further information, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Another question is someone is interested in hearing European Aluminium's and ASI's views on responsibly sourcing for post-consumer scraps to be recycled and returned to the aluminium value chain, how to manage social and human rights issues there. Maybe Krista, Director of Standards of ASI, can jump in to answer this question.
Can you give me the question again, Camille, just to make sure I hit it on the head?
Yes, I am interested in hearing European Aluminium and ASI's views on responsibly sourcing for post-consumer scraps to be recycled and returned to the aluminium value chain, how to manage social and human rights issues there.
And that value chain can be certainly one that is more complicated than some of the other sources in the aluminium supply chain, for sure. In the ASI standard, there's a requirement for facilities who source post-consumer scrap to do tier 1 due diligence. And then I think exactly what we saw today in terms of encouraging the virtuous supply chain going down is exactly what we would promote as well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Krista. And another question is, if a company supplies to 200 different customers, among them Constellium, do you expect that this company signs 200 different supplier chain of custodies, among them Constellium? Can you answer to that for ASI, Krista?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
If a company supplies to 200 different customers, among them Constellium, do you expect that this company signs 200 different supplier chain of custodies among Constellium? I think this question is more oriented on ASI side.
So one of the things that we are looking at in the standards revision is providing some standardization around this through the use of templates such as this one. But it depends. Different companies are going to do the different supply chains. We can't, or different supplier responsible sourcing, and we don't prescribe which ones folks use. So I could see a situation where that may occur, but I also think that over time there will be some alignment through tools just such as this one.
Okay, Krista, but I just read a comment that actually COC stands for Code of Conduct. Sorry about that. So maybe this question was more directed to you, Angela.
Oh, so can you repeat the questions again?
Yes, sorry. If a company supplies to 200 different customers, among them Constellium, do you expect that this company signs 200 different supplier code of conducts?
Yeah, I think that was still directed to me. Unless you had an answer, Angela, but I think it was really like, does ASI see that a company, a supplier could potentially have to sign 200 separate code of conducts, and one of them might be Constellium, another one would be another company. But you know, to my earlier answer, I think that could happen, but you'll see alignment. Yeah, Angela?
Yeah, actually, I would echo what Krista just mentioned. So I think with the time, we will see alignment, because we all know the main principles and topics, you know, in responsible sourcing and also in the code of conduct. So if your company's principle is actually aligned, you know, with these standards, then I don't see an issue for you to sign 200 code of conduct, because it's actually aligned with your own code of conduct. I think that's, you know, we have a lot of discussion with our suppliers. Our customer also asks us to sign their code of conduct. And the first thing we look at is if we are following the same principles, the same standards. So if, you know, as Krista said, with the time, you know, going by, we have created alignment and more people join the movement, the same direction. I don't see that will be an issue.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one last question. This one's also for you, Angela. Can you give some examples of where you have needed to blacklist suppliers due to ESG performance?
So I don't have an example for blacklist, because actually we're trying to take a more collaborative approach with the supplier. So we indeed, after audit or assessment, we review and discuss the result with the suppliers. We understand very well the limits of different kinds of assessments or audits. Sometimes they don't reflect exactly, and there are many different reasons behind, you know, the results. So we prefer to discuss with suppliers to also entice continuous improvement. I have an example with a supplier that they have 2 times very low EcoVadis score that is well below our expectations. And we understand that it's because EcoVadis is mostly, you know, document-based. And actually on the site that they supply us, they are actually performing well. So then we decided to do an on-site audit to verify the situation on-site. And the result came back actually positive. So the supplier also, you know, in the end told us, we think it was indeed quite some effort for us to do this, but it actually helped us to improve our internal process. I think that's a positive example. Coming back to the blacklist, I mean, well, actually now I look at it, we did drop a supplier, but that's really exception, because our philosophy, as I mentioned before, would you prefer to work with supplier and improve instead of dropping them?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, time is up, so thank you very much to both of you, Colleen and Angela, for your presentations, and also to you, Krista, for answering some questions. Sorry if we didn't have time to answer your questions. I see that there are still a lot that we didn't have time to go through. Here are our contact details, so feel free to contact us with your request after this webinar, and we will inform you when the recording is available. Thank you everyone for attending. Have a nice day.